Hall of Famer Ernie Banks has passed away at the age of 83. Banks, of course, was Mr. Cub, playing only in Chicago from 1953 to 1971.
He became the first African-American to play for the Chicago Cubs and the first number the team retired.
Perhaps Banks most remembered for this line, quote, "There's sunshine, fresh air, and the team's behind us. Let's play two."
In 1953, baseball scout Hugh Wise typed these words describing a 22-year-old Negro League baseball player named Ernest Banks. Hitting, good. Running, good. Attitude, very good. And while it was Mr. Wise's intent to describe Ernie Banks, the baseball player, he may as well have been describing Ernie Banks, the man, when he wrote in that very same report, quote, "No outstanding weaknesses."
The story of Ernie Banks does not revolve around the many accomplishments that made him a Hall of Famer. If his physical talents caught your eye, then it was his jubilant approach toward life that caught your heart.
Dad had quiet confidence on and off the field, with unflappable positivity. Who would have imagined you would become the icon of such a great city of Chicago?
I had the opportunity to room with Ernie for about 2.5 months. After then, I had to get out of that room.
I mean, just exuberant all the time. He was like a radio, you couldn't turn him off.
This human phenomenon, a bridge builder, odds buster, dream maker, disarmed adversaries with optimism. On his journey, he processed pain with joy and faith. He used excellence and a smile as weapons. Sometimes a smile reflects happiness, and sometimes a smile conceals what's deep within.
Hey, hey, holy mackerel, no doubt about it. The Cubs are on their way. Hey, hey, hey! Let's do it again here.
As far back as I can.
Well, hello, baseball fans, and thank you all so much for joining us today for our remembrance of someone who always brought a smile to our face, the great Ernie Banks. And in this world, while we know that no one is going to live forever, there are certain people who are just simply not supposed to die. The legendary Buck O'Neil, Lou Brock, of course, last week, the great Henry Aaron, and of course, our dear friend, Ernie Banks. And Ernie Banks was a fixture here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I'm Bob Kendrick. I'm president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And again, on behalf of our team, we thank all of you who have continually supported the museum over the last crazy year and all the years, of course, but even last year even more so because it was so doggone crazy. And somehow or another, we continue to weather the storm. And in large part, it is due to the support, the generosity and support of those of you who are tuning in today to hear this great conversation as we reflect on the life and times of Ernie Banks. The great Buck O'Neil was Ernie's surrogate father. He took care of Ernie. He nurtured Ernie when Ernie was here for the Kansas City Monarchs. And the two of them had a kindred relationship that carried them both through their lifetimes. And so, needless to say, Ernie Banks is tremendously special to us. And so, as we continue our celebration, moving from last year's 100th anniversary into now preparing for Negro Leagues 101, today's program is just one of many that you will have an opportunity to tune into throughout the course of the year. The one thing that we've learned during these tumultuous times of coronavirus is to embrace the virtual opportunities that come along now that allow us to connect with even more folks than we likely would have if we had had our special guest here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum today. And so this virtual world is one that we will absolutely continue to utilize so that we can bring you what we think are some thought-provoking programs throughout the remainder of this year and moving forward with this organization. So I'm very proud of what the Negro League Baseball Museum continues to do. We've had a tremendous run. We're so excited about the future as we move optimistically, looking into the future. And so again, thank you all for being a part of today's virtual live stream. And so I'm going to get out of the way and allow you all to hear from the two people who are bringing today's program. So it is my pleasure to welcome the Negro League Baseball Museum's Vice President of Curatorial Services, who will serve as today's moderator, and I will allow him the pleasure of introducing our very guest speaker as they begin a riveting conversation about the legendary Ernie Mr. Cub Banks. Please welcome Dr. Raymond Doswell.
Good morning, baseball fans, and welcome to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here in Kansas City, Missouri. It's a rainy day here in Kansas City, but it's always a good time to talk baseball. Again, I'm Dr. Raymond Doswell. I want to thank Bob Kendrick and our staff here for helping us present this program on the life of Ernie Banks. This program is typically what we call our baseball book notes program, where we love to bring in authors from across the country speaking about baseball, race, and sports. For those of you who usually join us here in Kansas City, it's a live event that we have on the Field of Legends, and we're able to do autograph signings afterwards. But of course, we're not able to do that, but we're fortunate through our virtual world to be able to bring you this wonderful program. We're very excited to have Ron Rapoport with us today to talk about his book, Let's Play 2, on the life of Ernie Banks. It's a book that came out in around 2019, so it was a missed opportunity for us to have him in town, but we're pleased that he's able to join us today to talk about this great book. Let's all welcome Ron to the program.
Hi, Ray. How are you? I'm just sorry I can't be there in Kansas City. A couple of restaurants I have that I'm particularly fond of. And it would be great to be with you at the museum. But this is great to be able to talk to you this way, too.
Well, we're excited to have you, and yes, this is a great food town. I know from experiencing a few pounds myself, but we're excited to have you and excited for this opportunity to talk about Ernie, or Mr. Banks, as I should say. But I did get a chance to spend time with him and know him and interview him over some years as well. January 31st would have been his 90th birthday. And so this gives us an occasion to talk about him and to talk about your wonderful book. But before we get too deep into his life, I did want our folks to know about you and writing this book. So just by way of introduction, tell us a little bit more about yourself. We know that you've been a writer in Chicago, as well as writing other sports books. Just give us a quick, brief biography of yourself.
Well, I grew up in Detroit, Ray, and my first introduction to baseball were some terrible Tiger teams back in the 50s, just awful. And I became the editor of the sports editor of the Stanford Daily the year that the football team went 0-10, lost every game. So I figured that was good training for covering some of those Cubs teams in the 70s and 80s. I was a sports columnist in Chicago and Los Angeles and sports writer for 35, 40 years. I kept bouncing back and forth between those two cities. I had 2 long tours in Chicago. The first time I came to Chicago as a sports writer, set foot in the town, was the day Ernie was voted into the Hall of Fame. He was excited, the town was excited. That was really a great moment, and that sort of set off my understanding of and later my relationship with Ernie.
Very good. But you've written about other sports figures. Just give us just a quick rundown of a couple of the other books you've done.
I wrote a book about Bobby Jones called The Immortal Bobby, which actually is coming out in paperback in March. And I've done other books. I did a book with Eddie Einhorn about the owner of the White Sox, about the March Madness, because he was a big television guy back in the days when basketball was turning from a regional game to the national college basketball to the game that we know today with the NCAA tournament and March Madness. I've done some anthologies, one of Ring Lardner's journalism, which had never been collected. Back in the 90s, I'm kind of proud to say that I did an anthology of women's sports writers, the first generation of women's sports writers who were coming into the business, and a collection of their wonderful work and stories about the problems they faced, and in many ways are still facing. I did an anthology of Chicago sports writers, starting in the 20s and moving up to 1920s, moving up to today. I've done a couple of non-sports books, one with Tom Dreesen and Tim Reed, who were the first black and white stand-up comedy team. The book is called Tim and Tom, about their days. So I've done a bunch of things along with my newspaper career. It's been fun. I will say,
yeah,
is maybe the one that I got into the deepest, the one I researched the most. It was supposed to be shorter than it is. I called the publisher and said, look, I need more time and I need more space. I've got too much good stuff here. And they were very accommodating to me, and I'm glad they did.
Fantastic. Would you find, though, that was writing about Ernie in particular a tough process? I know I learned a lot. There's lots of things he was covered, of course, extensively in Chicago and across the country. But was this, compared to other projects, any tougher, any easier in doing this? Since you had a penchant for writing about history as well as history and sports.
Well, I got a lot of cooperation. I should say that the book began as an autobiography. Ernie and I had a lot of sessions together where I was going to write it in his voice. And we started it at once, and then he decided he didn't want to do it. Then he called me a year later and said, what about the book? We did some more, and then he decided he didn't want to do it. It was very disappointing because he told me some wonderful things. He got deep into his life, behind the smile and behind, the public face that he presented to the world. And so I was disappointed when he pulled out. When he died, I decided to turn it into a biography. And I was a little nervous about how people would respond, the people that knew him well, because they knew him as a private guy. And I thought, gee, maybe they'd want to honor his privacy and not really talk to me. Well, the opposite happened. I started in Dallas, where I interviewed Ernie's older sister, Edna. Ernie is the second of 12 children. Edna is the oldest. She's 90, living in a home in Dallas. She told me wonderful stories about growing up in Dallas and the very poor neighborhood and the all-black neighborhood, of course. Ernie's younger brother, Walter, is still alive in Dallas. He told me great stories. Ernie's sons, twin sons, Joey and Jerry, live here in California. And they were very open with me about the pleasures and the problems of being Ernie Banks' son. I was very lucky, Ray, that I found 5 of his high school classmates who told me a lot about the neighborhood they grew up in, what it was like growing up in segregated, poor part of Dallas. I was able to talk to a lot of Ernie's teammates. Billy Williams was very helpful, putting me in touch with people like Ferguson Jenkins and Randy Hundley and Don Kessler. And they were all very helpful too. And then I talked to people who knew Ernie throughout his life and career. I ended up talking to more than 100 people, and they were all very outgoing. And it was as if they wanted people to know the real Ernie Banks, the man behind the smile. So I was very grateful to the help that I got along the way. The project wasn't easy, but it was a lot of fun.
Fantastic, because I know I had the opportunity of when I shared with you the oral history we did with Ernie Banks, and having seen him in public and interacted with him on public events and things like that. He certainly was a different man with his private thoughts, and I thought in our oral history was very candid about certain things. So I'm glad you were able to get that perspective from him, and to be able to share that with the public and include that in the book. I'm fascinated in particular that you said that you were able to talk to his siblings and classmates about his early life, and I'm very interested in that, especially the Dallas of his youth. What did you learn from them about his upbringing and what they all had to go through in Texas there?
Well, first let me say that I borrowed shamelessly from your oral history interview with Ernie. There were a couple of others. Yours was very good. Dallas was the neighborhood Ernie grew up in was very interesting. It was very poor. He grew up in a row house, the kind where you open the front door and you look through and there's the back door. No electricity, no plumbing, outhouse in the back. They relied on the WPA for beans and cheese and whatever food they could scrounge from the local grocery store. Life was hard. It was difficult. There were no white people around. Ernie had no conversations with white people really until he went into the Army. But there's another side to that neighborhood. It was very tight-knit, the black community in North Dallas. It was a kind of neighborhood where any adult could discipline any child. One of Ernie's classmates said the one thing he didn't want to hear walking down the street was, "Boy, stop doing that," because you knew that whoever caught you doing bad stuff or misbehaving was going to tell your parents. And so it was the kind of neighborhood where, yes, it was poor, and yes, they didn't have a lot of advantages, but there was a YMCA where they could play basketball, where they could hang out, where they could socialize. And there was a very good high school, the Booker T. Washington High School. Ernie learned a lot there. He was taught Black history by the principal of the school had learned from Booker T. Washington's daughter. So they learned a lot about the Booker T. Washington philosophy of self-help and self-uplift and so on. That school meant a lot to that neighborhood. All of Ernie's classmates who I talked to have become doctors and lawyers and businessmen. And that school, and then there was another black school that came on later, Lincoln High School, helped set the way, educated the doctors and lawyers and teachers and civil rights leaders in the future. And they were a part of Dallas's burgeoning professional and middle class in the black community. So Ernie learned a lot there. Yes, he was poor, but he had a family that loved him, a mother and father. He had 11 siblings, although some of them came along much later when he was already playing ball. But it was a poor neighborhood, and it was a segregated neighborhood. But Ernie learned a lot there, and he looked back on it fondly. He told stories about his mother giving him sewing up a jacket for him, the first jacket he'd ever worn, and going to the prom, and the girl leaving with somebody else. He told all kinds of stories. And he looked back on that age and his time in Dallas with great affection.
Fantastic. Hey, we're talking with Ron Rapoport here from Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and our tribute to Ernie Banks. Just a reminder before I forget, if you don't already have the book, there are ways that you can get it, obviously. We sell them here at the museum store, online at nlbm.com/store, and there'll be other ways. Obviously, we want you to grab a book and enjoy Ron's great writing. It takes a village, to raise our leaders here, and the stories about Dallas are just really important that you shared that with us. But ultimately, Ernie has a talent, and that talent is baseball, and that's nurtured while he's in Dallas, but ultimately leads to an opportunity for him to become a professional baseball player. Of course, we're not going to give away everything in the book. We want you to buy it, but these are some prescient stories we want to hear more about. So tell us about his interest in baseball, what you recall from the book, and how he ends up joining the Kansas City Monarchs.
Well, there was a Negro Leagues player, former Negro Leagues player in Dallas named Bill Blair. And he became a very famous man in Dallas. He became a big civil rights leader. He started the Dallas Black newspaper the Elite News, which I believe is still publishing.
Yes, it is.
He was sort of a Pied Piper to the boys in North Dallas. They loved to listen to his stories about playing in the Negro Leagues. He played for the Indianapolis Clowns, some other teams, and he told wonderful stories about it, and he really piqued their interest. But it was more than that. He was sort of the guy who they all watched and copied and so on. And the way Ernie got into sports was he was standing on the football field at Booker T. Washington High watching practice. And Bill Blair came up to him and saw this skinny young guy and he said to him, "What are you doing watching? Go get yourself a uniform." Well, Ernie was not going to disobey Bill Blair. He was their god, you know. So the next thing you knew, he was playing football and running track. This skinny guy. It turned out he had good hands even then. And he was a good end. He was a good pass catcher. So that was how he got into sports. Well, Blair nurtured him playing softball. He got him hooked up with a semi-pro softball team that toured around Texas. Amarillo was where it was based, but they played in a lot of cities in Texas, and Kansas, and Nebraska even. So that gave Ernie a sense of traveling and so on. Well, Bill Blair was a good friend of Buck O'Neill's. And at one point he said, "I've got a player here for you." And Darrell Blair, Bill's son, recreated the conversation for him. He says, Buck says, "Bill, can he pick him up and put him down?" and Bill said, "Buck, if I say he's ready to play, you put your foot on it." So Bill Blair bought Ernie his first suit and put him on the train to Kansas City. Now he'd been seen by a Cool Papa Bell too, who had also given some good response. Well, at 18 years old in 1950, there's Ernie in Kansas City. And I've got to tell you, Ray, he never had more fun playing baseball than he did with the Monarchs. He told stories about Buck would take him out into the practice field. It's 100 degrees. The sun is beaten down. They're just dying out there. And Buck is hitting ground ball after ground ball after ground ball to Ernie. And Ernie tells his story. He hit it to the left, he hit it to the right, he hit it high, he hit it low. Ernie said, that was as much fun as I've ever had playing baseball. He just loved Buck, and he loved playing the Monarchs. You know, 3 years later, when he got the call from the Cubs, he didn't want to go. I'm having too much fun here. Remember now, they lived together, they played together, they traveled together, they went to the same restaurants, the same clubs. Ernie was comfortable. Well, finally, Sherwood Brewer, the Monarchs' great infielder, who had talked Jackie Robinson a lot, playing the infield, said, "Ernie, you've got to go. You're getting your chance." He didn't say, "You're getting the chance we didn't have," but that was implied. You've got to go. You've got to take the next step. So Ernie, the team ended up their season in Pittsburgh, and Buck gave him $10 and put him on the bus to Chicago. Late in the 1953 season, he did not want to leave.
You know, I think it's interesting though that even the fact that Jackie Robinson got a chance to go up and other players were having a success or starting to have success in MLB, that he was still reluctant to make that leap. It had to be more than just that he was having fun in Kansas City, I would think.
Well, remember, Ernie had grown up in an all-black neighborhood. He'd never had any conversations or interactions with white people. He went into the Army, where for the first time he was around white people, but they immediately put him on a baseball team. That's what he did in there. He was really lucky. He was in Germany. Korean War was going on. Some of his classmates were sent to Korea. Ernie was lucky. He was sent to Germany, where he started playing ball. Well, yes, he was around white people, but he was in his comfort zone. He liked playing baseball. So now he comes back to Kansas City for his final year, 1953. And he's comfortable. He's playing. As a matter of fact, he was injured for a while. He left the team for a while. Buck had to go back to Dallas and to drag him back to the team. But now, towards the end of the season, he really started playing well. He really started showing signs of what he could be. And when they said that even before the season ended, he had to go to Chicago, he was uncomfortable about that. He was happy. He was playing well. He was expressing himself as a ball player and enjoying life in Kansas City. So when he went to Chicago, he was not real happy about it. Ray, when he got there, he was even more uncomfortable. Now, this is September. The Cubs are 40 games out of first place. The players don't really care very much. You know, he was with Ralph Kiner and Hank Sauer, and some good players. But when the game was over, they all scattered to their homes. Ernie wasn't used to that. He was used to hanging out with his teammates. So now he and Gene Baker, fine infielder who the Cubs had brought up, who was older and had more experience, grown up in Iowa, and he'd been around white people. He and Gene Baker would go to the South Side, to their hotel. And Ernie was uncomfortable where blacks had to stay. But this was the first time he was in a pretty much white environment. And it took him a lot of getting used to. So that was what he missed about Kansas City.
Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know Eugene Baker was also a teammate on the Kansas City Monarchs. Actually, I believe was signed by the Cubs before Banks, and Banks came up just a little bit later, if I recall, if I've got that timeline correct.
Right. Actually, Gene was playing with the Los Angeles Angels, he didn't play for the Monarchs. So he went straight to never played in the Negro Leagues. He went straight to the minors. But, you know, after Jackie Robinson integrated the major leagues, there was a big integration of the minor leagues. Hundreds of players played. So, Gene, you're right. He was actually signed to a Cubs contract before Ernie was, 2 weeks before. They were brought up together September 23rd, 1953, but Gene was hurt. He couldn't play for a couple of days. So Ernie became the first black Cub. In a way, Gene should have been, because he was a good player and should have been brought up earlier. But the Cubs were smart to bring up Gene, who was older and more used to what was going on in the world, to be Ernie's kind of mentor and roommate and so on. I'll tell you that even at the end of that 1953 season, Ernie had to learn how different the big leagues were from anything he had experienced any time in his life. The team made their first road trip to Kansas City. Well, the bus pulled up and all the white players got off the team and went into the Chase Hotel. Then a car pulled up and Gene and Ernie got into it and were driven by a man who owned a boarding house in the black part of town. And this was new. This was new to Ernie. And he wasn't going to be with his teammates all the time. That life was different now. When they took the train from Chicago to St. Louis on that trip, they made a stop at the 63rd Street station where Gene and Ernie got on. This is the black neighborhood. And Ernie heard one of his teammates say, "Where are we, South Africa?" And Ernie went like this, and he went through to Gene, and Gene said to him, "You know, some people shouldn't drink so much." And Ernie had a lot of getting used to. That was, why he missed that nice cocoon in Kansas City.
Interesting. Like a lot of ball players, he certainly had to endure those indignities of the times, but ultimately it didn't greatly affect his performance on the field, because he certainly proved to be one of the great players and great talents that come through the Cubs. I want to remind folks too that we are able to monitor your comments through the chat on all the different platforms, and where we can, we'll interject questions to Ron as we go along. But one of the things that one of our chatters had noted, and you noted about the fact that, you know, there was these unfortunate Cubs teams and that history having ultimately talents like Banks and Billy Williams and others, but it notes that Ernie had the liability of not batting against Cubs pitching.
You know, it's funny. One of the things we talk about Ernie's attitude and let's play two, and it's a beautiful day for a ball game, and that's what we remember him for, Mr. Sunshine and the rest of it. What tends to be forgotten is what a truly great baseball player Ernie Banks was. From 1955 to 1960, we're talking 6 years, Ernie had more home runs and more runs batted in than Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Eddie Matthews, anybody else in baseball. He won 2 home run titles during that season, 2 RBI titles, back-to-back MVP awards for a 6th place team. But here's the thing that kind of set Ernie's reputation as we know it today. Willie Mays, Henry Aaron, Eddie Matthews, Mickey Mantle, all went to the World Series as fairly young men. They were made, you know. They were champions. They had come to the highest level. In those 6 seasons where Ernie was the most productive power hitter in baseball, the Cubs finished a total of 123 games out of 30. Ernie never played for a team that won more games than it lost until he was 32 years old. He never played for a team that finished in the first division until he was 36. He had, you made a joke about not facing Cubs pitching. One of those seasons, I think 55, Ernie hit 5 grand slam home runs, which was the record then. And somebody in Chicago said, "You mean the Cubs loaded the bases 5 times?" And he played for those terrible teams, and he got no attention. Here he was, such a great player. I'll tell you one story. 1959, he's closing in on his 2nd consecutive MVP. And Chicago was on fire with baseball fever for the White Sox, who were going to the World Series for the first time in 40 years.
Yeah.
Ernie, late in September in 1955, hits his 42nd home run. Great moment in his career. Ray, he played before 598 fans at Wrigley Field. Not 5,000.
500.
I mean, he was invisible. He was like this butterfly, this unicorn. He was something rare, but he was almost in private, like he was putting on his own show for his own few fans. It was such a shame that by the time he got to the Worlds, he got into a pennant race for the first time in his life. He was 38 years old, but even then, there's another story. The last day of the 1969 season, okay? The Mets have clinched. The Cubs have had this terrible fold. The miracle Mets have come back and they clinched. And now it's all over. The pennant race is all over. But both teams have 2 games left to play, and they're against each other in Chicago. The Mets come to town to play out the street. Well, the few Cub fans that were there, a couple of thousand, didn't know who to be madder at. The Mets for beating their little darlings, or the little darlings for blowing. Ken Holtzman gets a letter in the clubhouse returning his autograph. Ron Sato gets a letter saying, "This is mean." He says, "I wish you died in that plane crash." Small plane. Oh. They're yelling, they're screaming. Now the game is over, and the fans, I forget who won, doesn't matter. The fans are running out onto the field, tearing the place apart, ripping up the turf, just making a terrible ruckus. Upstairs, the organist is playing "Happy Days Are Here Again." Unnoted in that game, not even written about, was the fact that Ernie had a homer, a triple, and drove in 3 runs. Ray gave him 106 RBIs for the season, which was, for a long time, the most home runs, most RBIs ever by a 38-year-old man. Babe Ruth had 104, Ty Cobb had 103, Willie Mays had 58. Again, he was doing it in private. The circumstances were so different that Ernie's talents as a baseball player, the more I worked on this book, the more frustrated I was. He was a great shortstop. He set the mold for shortstop. Shortstops in that time were little guys. Here Ernie comes in and hits hitting 40 home runs. That was as many as all the other shortstops in the league put together. Well, now we have home run hitting shortstops. We have, he changed the way people look at shortstops. So we talk about Ernie the man and Ernie the player, and Ernie, what a great guy he was and so on. But we really need to remember what a great player he was too.
I appreciate that, and you outlined it very well. Just and compared to his contemporaries, and it's why he's a Hall of Famer in particular. I mean, those White Sox teams with Minoso, it had some good runs and could certainly overshadow the Cubs, but at some point, the Cubs do become the darlings, but a lot of their players, even future players, great players, become stars, but some ways not getting the same levels of recognition. But fortunately, Ernie did, but playing in those shadows of not having that fan support is very interesting. One of our commenters here online was asking specifically about the fact that, well, why were they trying to convert him with Buck O'Neil, convert him from shortstop to first base, and how well did he do with that?
Well, Ernie was a very good shortstop, but his legs gave out. His knees gave out. When he was in the Army, they had put him in traction. He had terrible trouble with his legs. Today, they'd have gone in with some arthroscopic surgery and taken care of it. But Ernie's range was gone at shortstop. He'd been a very good shortstop. Yeah, every throw was on time and on target, and he had good range and so on. But they had to move him. He just couldn't get around that much anymore. So he went to first base, a position he was not familiar with. And you're right, they did bring in Buck to help him. This was 1962, and Buck monitored him and helped him with the footwork and so on. And in the end, he became quite a good first baseman. He didn't have the range anymore, but if you threw the ball to him, he was going to catch it. He could scoop it up and so on. An interesting sidelight about Buck mentoring him in Chicago was that they gave Buck a uniform. They made him a coach. He was the first black coach in the big leagues. And Sporting News and everybody, was saying, see, we're not bigoted. We finally have a black coach. Here's an interesting story, though. This was when the Cubs' notorious college of coaches was going on. Remember? One guy would coach the team for 2 weeks. Another guy would coach the team for 2 weeks. They had this rotating system. It was awful. I mean, it was just terrible. The coaches were all fighting with each other. They were all jockeying for position. Lou Brock said, the problem, you wanted to be if you wanted to be insubordinate, you didn't know who to be insubordinate to, that kind of a thing. Well, they gave Buck the uniform because they wanted him in the dugout to monitor Ernie during the games. And Buck traveled with them. And it was made very clear when he was brought up that Buck would not be in the rotation to be one of the coaches who would be the managers. They made that very clear. They said it out loud. Now the Cubs go on the road, and Buck is in the dugout. And then both the manager and the third base coach get into an argument with the umpire. And they're both thrown out of the game. Well, Buck should have gone to third base. I mean, he was there. They didn't bring him in. They waved into the bullpen and brought in the bullpen coach. That was Buck's one chance to set foot on a major league field when the game was going on. And he was bitter about it. Yeah. He was mad about it. He thought he should have had his chance. So even when they were trying to help Ernie with Buck, there was still that reticence about letting a black man on the field to coach or manage.
Yeah, I've heard Lou Brock and George Altman tell versions of that story, and for even someone who like Buck O'Neil, who we know and loved as as positive a person as possible you could possibly imagine, next to Ernie Banks as well, that was again among the bitter things that black players and coaches had to deal with in those times. But I'm sure they drew inspiration from people like Jackie Robinson, who after baseball became a broadcaster and certainly covered them in different games. Would you like to just talk a little bit about Ernie's relationship with Robinson and how important he was to him?
Yeah. In 1950, when Ernie was in his first season with the Monarchs, he wasn't really playing very well. He didn't really have a great year. He was not showing what he could do. But Jackie had these barnstorming teams, put together these barnstorming teams that toured the South and the West. And it was almost demanded by the black fans in the South who had heard so much about Jackie. There was no television. They wanted to see their hero. So he would put together a team that would go to like 30 different cities. And he had put together a good team in 1950. Roy Campanella was on it, Don Newcomb, Larry Doby. And then he asked Ernie to come. And Ernie's reaction was, when he was told that Jackie wanted him to play, was, Jackie Robinson knows who I am? I mean, Jackie Robinson was his hero too. Remember, he was only 18 now. So he goes to wherever they were getting ready. And kind of nervous and excited at the same time. Well, he was even more excited when Jackie took him under his wing, taught him little things about how to play, told him things about how to carry himself. And Ernie was in awe. And he never forgot. He always repeated. One thing that Jackie told him was, don't talk, listen. He always remembered that. Well, they went on the road to Barnstorm. They were playing against the Indianapolis Clowns. And they went from city to city to city. Now the tour ends up in Dallas, Ernie's hometown. Well, Ernie's dad, Eddie, had been a catcher for the Dallas Green Monarchs, a minor league Negro Leagues team. He was a catcher. He loved baseball. He'd sit up all night and sew up a glove, and he paid Ernie a nickel to go play ball with him in the yard. Ernie didn't want to play catch. Well, now Eddie comes down on the field before the game, looking around, talking to Ernie, and how excited he is. Well, at one moment, Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella and Larry Dolan and Don Newcomb all came over to Eddie and said, what a fine young man your son was. What a fine player, and what a great future Ernie had. And Ernie said, my dad smoked 2 cigars that day, and the time it usually took him to smoke one.
What a proud moment that must have been. Exciting.
Yeah, he was in awe. Well, all of the young black players then were in awe of Jackie for what he had done and how he had fought through it and so on. Wendell Smith, the great sports writer, wrote a column comparing Ernie and Jackie at one point. And he talked about Jackie's aggressiveness, and take no prisoners attitude, and competitiveness, compared to Ernie's kind of mellow, laid back. Wendell wrote that Jackie stormed his way through baseball, and Ernie floated through it on a gentle breeze.
That's an apt metaphor. I like that. I like that a lot.
Good writer. I love reading stuff.
Yeah, we've got a few more minutes with you, and I do want to explore a little bit more about those players in those times. But we did have an interesting question from the chat. I didn't want to miss this. They wanted to ask you, did the Cubs ever consider trading Banks, or did they ever get any good trade offers for Banks?
Well, I had a couple of interesting conversations with Hank Aaron, which I was very grateful for. Hank and Ernie were dear friends. He told me a story that he had heard that Ernie was coming to the Braves. It was going to be like a 9-player deal. Warren Spahn, who was 39, Joe Adcock, others like that. But it never really happened. It was interesting. You kept hearing rumors. There was a rumor he was going to go to the Dodgers for this young pitcher, left-hander, guy named Koufax. That never panned out. It was mostly just rumors. He was going to go to Detroit and play with Al Kaline. But by the time this happened, Ernie was not. He was showing his age now. He would have a bad year and a good year. He got the bumps one year of all things. Didn't play well. They were writing him off as just the end of Ernie Banks when he was in his early 30s. But then he'd have a good year, followed by a bad year, followed by a good year. So he wasn't really the great star he had been. And it was a question of what could they get for him. And at that point, he really was Mr. Cub. He really was the face of the franchise. And I think at one point, Philip Wrigley put his foot down and said, Ernie's going to be a Cub. That's going to be the end of it. So I think the stories about trading him, there might have been some substance to some of them, but mostly they were just kind of the fanciful rumor mongering stuff that goes on in baseball.
Yeah, indeed. So you talked about the comparisons between Robinson as both a player, and yes, he was an aggressive player. People compared him to Ty Cobb when he came up as a ball player, ironically, and players like Banks and even Aaron and Mays were players who were players who the game came so easy to them in many respects as ball players. But of course, Robinson had a different kind of courage than most of any person, as well as a ball player, and certainly was outspoken about many of the issues that were affecting the ball players themselves and what was happening in society. I know Robinson was certainly had his issues with other ball players not speaking out on the civil rights issues. I know he had, even though he was great friends with Roy Campanella, for example, I know they had their differences about how to approach these issues. But Ernie Banks's easygoing style was probably something that didn't afford the opportunities for him to either do the same. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. One of my chats with Hank Aaron, he told me that in the late 50s and early 60s, when the civil rights protests and marches were happening, that he felt isolated in Milwaukee and in Atlanta. He felt like he didn't have the platform. Hank was very civil rights minded, and he called Ernie, and he called Willie Mays, and he said, you know, I'm stuck in these small areas. I need help. Ernie, you're in Chicago. Willie, you're in California. We need to speak out and tell people that that improvements need to be made. And Hank said that both Willie and Ernie wouldn't do it. And it hurt Hank. He felt not betrayed, but he felt very unhappy that he was left alone to do it. Ernie's attitude was, the thing you have to understand about Ernie above all, is that he avoided controversy, avoided drama, avoided anything reeking of any kind of difficulty at all. His nickname in high school was Casper, because every time the boys acted up or did something they shouldn't have done, they turned around and Ernie was gone. He disappeared anytime there was any attitude toward trouble. And that was the way he lived his life, and that was the way he played baseball. He just didn't want to get involved in the civil rights movement. I have to tell you that he took a lot of heat from that. A lot of the more militant black people were very unhappy with him. One guy even said, Ernie's not an Uncle Tom, or he's not even a Negro. I mean, ouch, you know. But Ernie was what he was. He took this. This was his attitude. He just wasn't going to get involved. And looking at it at that time, it's unfortunate. But here we are 50, 60 years later, looking back at it from a historical perspective. And I think we can see what Ernie and some of the other players who didn't speak out that much meant. I had a long talk with Jesse Jackson about this. And also Timuel Black, the wonderful historian in Chicago, talked a lot about this. He said that there were different ways of contributing to black advancement. Some people talked and some people did. What Timuel Black and Jesse Jackson told me was, they proved what we had always been saying, that given a chance, we could compete on any level. And Ernie proved that by going out and performing at a high level. That was his contribution. I got a message on Facebook from somebody who'd been a young man living in the north side of Chicago, where he never once got in contact, spoke with, met a black person. He would run home after school and catch the ends of the Cubs games. And then he would see Jack Brickhouse and Ernie talking, interviewing after the game, man to man, black man, white man. And he would see Ernie and Jack shake hands. He never forgot that. That was his first experience. Mm-hmm. So Ernie, and what Jesse Jackson said was, you have to look at the civil rights movement as a progression. One thing following another, one thing leading to another. And then Jesse Jackson said, you know, we knew Ernie before we knew Martin Luther King. So from a historical perspective, Ernie played his part. When it came to speaking out, that wasn't what he did. He was uncomfortable with it. Late in life, he expressed some regrets. He said, when he saw the pictures of the dogs being unleashed on black marchers and protesters in the South, he wondered, you know, whether his boys would ever say, where were you, Daddy? But he said, the struggle was baseball. That was my struggle. So you can condemn Ernie for not being involved in the ways that maybe others were at that time. But from a historical perspective, I think you can look back and say that he played his part too.
Indeed. Very good. Very good assessment. We're nearing the top of the hour, and we just got a couple more questions for our guest, Ron Rapoport, here. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, and in terms of too, of just even just being an example for civil rights and just being an example of a good teammate and things like that, I'd be remiss if I didn't have you at least talk about his relationships with people like Billy Williams and Ron Santo.
Well, you know, that was a wonderful team, that 69 team. There were 4 people who ended up in the Hall of Fame. You know, it's a shame that they lost tragically, so tragically. His teammates adored him. The ones I talked to, they looked up to him. They just thought he was, you know, somebody to be emulated and admired and the rest of it. But they all told me that they never really understood him. Ernie didn't hang out. The only place you saw him on the road was on the bus to the ballpark if he didn't take a cab, or at the ballpark. He was never in the hotel. He was never in the bars. He never really spent a lot of time. Guys like Ron Santo and Billy Williams and Glenn Beckert and Don Kessinger all hung out together. Ernie did not. Murphy's Bar across the street from Wrigley Field, across from center field, where a lot of players would hang out. And, you know, they would just chat with the fans and so on. It was very informal. Ernie was never there. He was gone. So they loved Ernie. They respected Ernie. He didn't speak up in the clubhouse. That wasn't the kind of guy he was. He would just sit and listen. He was not a leader in the clubhouse. That role fell to other Cubs. And so they loved Ernie. They respected him. They admired him. But none of them really felt truly close to him and understanding him. It was interesting.
Very interesting. Appreciate that perspective. One more question for you before we wrap up. But before we do that, I just want to remind folks again, we really thank you for joining the program. If you don't have a copy of Ron's book, you can order it through our museum store at nlbm.com/shop. And of course, wherever else you buy books. It's called Let's Play 2, and it's about the life of Ernie Banks. I want to give you the last word, Ron, and just your overall assessment of the legacy of Ernie Banks as both, we've talked about him as a ball player, but just as a humanitarian and what he means to the game and our history.
Well, Ernie means so much. You know, I have a whole chapter in the book about the origin of Let's Play 2. You know, it's part of the vocabulary now. You hear it all the time. Yeah. Let's play do this, let's play do that. It's beyond baseball. You know, Willie Nelson and Bob Dylan once went on a tour of minor league ballplayers, music tour of minor league ballplayers. They called it the Let's Play 2 tour. Ernie was friendly with Hillary Clinton, and he would show up at her rallies, and you know, she would say afterwards, "This was a great rally. Let's have 2." That kind of thing. A guy wrote a play about baseball called Let's Play 2. It's part of the vocabulary. It's his lasting contribution to us, you know. And what I found out was that there's about 6 different versions of how it came about. One of the reasons for that is Ernie told 6 different versions. But that's Ernie. But I think we remember him with love and affection, you know. He had his troubles, you know. He had difficulties later in life, financial difficulties, health difficulties. But that's not what we remember about him. We remember the sunshine. We remember the smile. We remember him always being there and being upbeat and being around kids and so on. You know, he would sign autographs in his heyday when he was really, you know, Mr. Cub and everybody loved him, for hours. And people would say to him, "Ernie, why are you signing all those autographs for those young kids?" And he said, "Some of them might grow up and give me a job someday." Ernie was always there. I make it that he is the most popular person ever to live in Chicago. I mean, who else you got? Richard Daley, people didn't like his politics. Oprah maybe, but she's kind of a worldwide phenomenon. Whereas Ernie was Chicago. I mean, he was Chicago. He was not only Mr. Cub, he was Mr. Chicago. He was there for 60 years as player, and coach, and just presence, you know. He's always going to be a part of Chicago, and I think he's always going to be have a part of being a part of baseball, what we think of baseball in its best light, in its best days, and it's the game that we all grew up loving. I think Ernie is always going to be a big part of that. Maybe that's his legacy.
Very good. I like that. Baseball in its best light and in its best days. I think that's a great way to remember him and to end our program. So, again, thank you to Ron Rapoport. Don't forget to purchase the book, Let's Play 2, which again is available through our museum store and in other outlets. Thank you for getting up early for us, Ron.
Do it, Ray. It's been a great pleasure. And one day I'm going to come shake your hand at the museum. How's that?
We would love that very much. Folks, if you like this program, we will be back next week with another discussion on the great Oscar Charleston with author Jeremy Beer, talking about his award-winning biography of Oscar Charleston. So again, Ernie Banks' birthday will be tomorrow. He would have been 90. And there's the program with Jeremy Beer, but we want to remember Ernie Banks on his 90th birthday, which is actually the same birthday he shares with Jackie Robinson as well, two great legendary icons. Again, I'm Raymond Doswell from the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum signing off. Thank you, and thanks for your support of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Have a great day.